Hello and welcome back to A Literal Journey, a show dedicated to fantastic authors of great stories. In this episode, I interviewed Summer Rachel Short. She's a phenomenal author of 3 best-selling books. The first one is The Mutant Mushroom Takeover, and then the sequel to that book is Attack of the Killer Komodos. And my personal favorite, the one that came out just this year, is called The Legend of Greyhallow. Now, I just finished my interview with Summer, and I have to say that I'm absolutely astounded and amazed by her and the work that she's done. Not only is Summer a fantastic author of great stories, 3 of them, but she's also the fantastic author of her own story, and I really mean that. During the interview, it became apparent that the work that she does as a homeschooling mom is what led her to become a best-selling author. And that amazed me. It really did amaze me that she said she was sitting and watching a documentary about mushrooms with her kids for a homeschooling lesson. And that story is what led her to become a best-selling author. It's an incredible journey, but I don't want to spoil it for you. So without further ado, here is the interview with Summer Rachel Short. All right, well, we're recording. Summer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, it was wonderful to connect. I mean, people on Twitter, I don't normally want to reach out to people on Twitter just because it tends to be a pretty aggressive environment, but I saw your account there and what you had been publishing, and then we just reached out and started talking, and I immediately got your latest book, which is The Legend of Greyhallow.
Yeah, I'm glad you reached out. That's great.
When did that come out?
That came out on July 18th, so this summer. Yeah, just about a little over a month ago.
Wow. That's an amazing feeling to have a book published and out there, and I hope it's doing great. Just give us a bit of background on who you are, where you're from, and basically what built up and led you to become an author.
Sure. So right now I live in North Texas is what we call it down here, and kind of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And I've been here about 15 years. Before that, I lived in a variety of states. I lived in California and Oklahoma and Idaho. So I've lived in a few different places, but Texas is home now. And my background, before I started writing fiction, I have a journalism degree, and I worked in corporate communications and public relations and that type of,
so exciting, very exciting stuff.
Yes.
Very thrilling writing, yeah.
Yes. It was better than doing math in my way of thinking. When I was looking at majors and things in college, I honestly was like, okay, which degrees am I not going to have to do, heavy duty math in, which, everyone has different giftings. So, mine lie more with, the words and
right
literature and things as opposed to the math and all of that. So yeah, I think it was about 8 years ago or so is when I really got serious about trying to write my first novel. Before that, I kind of dabbled in mostly short fiction. I took some short story writing classes in college. I would kind of outline things, and that would be about as far as I would get. Right. I would, have an idea and maybe work on it for 2 or 3 days, and then that would be it. But yeah, I think it was about 8 years ago, I always track everything by how old like my kids were. So I think it was about my youngest, who's 9 now. He was a baby. So something kind of clicked, and I got very serious about wanting to really try to see if I could finish a novel and what I could do with all of that. So my journey kind of began there.
Wow, that's amazing. So he was one or 2 or something?
He was almost 2. Yeah. So he's like 9.5 now. And I think he was still 1, but he was almost 2. I had 2 older kids. Well, not much older. I think they were like 6 or maybe 8. I think they were like 8, 4, and the 1 or something like that. So I had, 3 little kids at home, and I was homeschooling. And that's actually kind of part of what led into me wanting to start writing again. I think I was reading a lot of good books to them, and I think just getting really kind of back engaged in some of that kind of younger writing. They call sometimes like that time period of books like the golden age of reading, that type of thing for kids. So reading some of that was part of what reignited my interest in fiction again.
That's great. And I mean, so you had 3 kids at the time. Your youngest was about 2. You're homeschooling, and then that's when you decide, I'm going to be writing. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how did you actually find time to do that?
Yeah. So at that stage, it was, that's like the very hands-on, very, tiring years of parenting. So I think that was part of it though, too, because I'd spent so many years just being at home with the kids, not just, but, where that was like my whole focus, which was great. But also I think it created like that desire of wanting to also tap into some of that creativity that I had pursued earlier. Yeah. So people have all sorts of things that they want to do. I wanted to be with my kids, but I also wanted to pursue this. So I just mostly would either wake up early or stay up late and get time in to work on it, because when they were awake or at that time, not everybody was napping. It would have been only the baby who would have been napping. So yeah, it was really just waking up early or trying to stay up late just to get some time in. And, it worked, and it was rewarding to me and worthwhile to do it because, I just really wanted to try to pursue that avenue of creativity and seeing what could become of creating these stories. You never know when you're working on something what like the end of it will be. But, I think we have a feeling that, there's some purpose to things and all of that. So I felt a lot of passion for wanting to pursue that.
So then at that point you were working on the manuscript. Was it your first your series of books? It's 2 books. Mm-hmm. The Mutant Mushrooms series.
No, it wasn't that. Yeah. So when I first started, I was thinking I was going to write for like a young adult audience or maybe even middle grade. I kind of, at first, I really didn't know very much about novel writing. So probably the first maybe 3 or so months, I just kind of bounced around different things I would start and maybe write something like 3,000 to 5,000 words of a project and not really know what to do with it. Because I hadn't learned really how to plot a novel. I was doing a lot of research online and buying books on how to write, a novel and all of that. But it's pretty daunting, a big, long, because I think most people who haven't written a novel, maybe the longest thing we've ever written is maybe an essay for college or something like that. So to go from maybe something max 10 pages to now you're trying to write, a 200 or 300 page thing. So in the beginning, I started a lot of different things. I would write down an idea, I'd have an idea for a character and maybe a setting, but I didn't, and a little bit of a plot kind of thing. So it probably took me at least 3 months, maybe it's 6, I don't know, before I kind of zoned in on something where I could go further with it. And that was a young adult novel, and it was set like a boarding school, and it had some fantasy elements and things like that, which was not like my first published novel. Mm-hmm. But I feel like sometimes you write a practice novel or 2 or 3. I mean, I wrote a practice novel basically, that helped me to learn how to write a novel. And so the second novel I wrote was the book that became my debut novel, which is the Mutant Mushroom Takeover.
Yeah, tell me about that, Mutant Mushroom Takeover, and then so where that idea came from, what it's about, basically. Give us a kind of a synopsis, yeah. and then we'll talk about it getting accepted and what that was like.
Yeah. So the Mutant Mushroom Takeover, I like to say that the Mutant Mushroom Takeover and Attack of the Killer Komodos, they're kind of like weird nature, weird science mysteries. They both have elements of real science in them, both of those books that are part of the series, and then have elements that are just, kind of over the top science fiction. Mm-hmm. So the Mutant Mushroom Takeover is set in a small Texas town, And the main characters are Maggie, who loves science and nature, and her best friend Nate, who he's a wannabe YouTuber. He, is kind of like looking for like conspiracy type stuff, like aliens or, Bigfoot. And so when the woods outside their town start to take on this like green and blue glow, Nate is, thinking it's got to be something paranormal. Is it aliens or, whatever? And Maggie, the science loving girl is sure that there's a reasonable explanation. So, that's kind of what's going on there. The real science there is it's bioluminescent fungi, but it's like weird, it's mutant in this book. So strange things happen.
Wow.
And the part of the idea for that one is with homeschooling, my kids and I were actually watching a fungi documentary, and it was called, I think it was from like 1980, and we found it on YouTube. I think it's called something like Fungi, the Rotten World Around Us or something like that. And it opens with all this kind of like spooky music of like the sinister like plans of fungi, like parasitic fungi. And so there are a lot of their processes that they actually work by and the way that they get inside animals and stuff, it seems pretty like nefarious. You're like, whoa. So that sparked my interest. I started doing more research, and I learned about a fungus called its official name is Ophiocordyceps. But
that's the show they made that's based on it.
Yeah. So this was the video game, I think, was already out at that time. I had never heard of it, but so it's also nicknamed the zombie ant fungus. So I kind of tucked that away, and my writer brain that's interesting. And then around the same time, my oldest, who I think was like 10 at the time, told me he thought I should write a story about a pirate named Rootbeard. He wanted the pirate to have a beard made of living tree roots. I was like, that's interesting. A character who's part human, part plants. That's interesting. So I kind of tucked that away. And so in the Mutant Mushroom Takeover, there is a character. He's not a pirate, and he's not named Rootbeard, but there is a character inspired by like my son's request. Since it's called the Mutant Mushroom Takeover, you can probably imagine like fungi and knowing zombie ant fungus. So that was kind of part of the original concept, and I started to think about, okay, if I want to have this fungus, and it's gonna be infecting people, in animals and all of that, what sort of character would be the best character to deal with something like this? And, it seemed like that the character would probably need to be someone who had some type of interest in science, or nature, or something that would allow them to be able to investigate this and solve it. It's kind of like I think a little bit about like the X-Files, but like for kids, because you've got a character who's like looking for the scientific and reasonable explanations for things, which is Maggie. And then you have a character who is, just looking for everything is weird and I want to know about it. So
that's amazing. So what I really love about that is that it's literally an idea that came as the result of interacting with your kids and watching a documentary on mushrooms. I mean, you could never imagine that you'd be watching a documentary on mushrooms, and then fast forward into the future, you've written a bestseller series on mushrooms. It's amazing. Yeah. It's an amazing story in and of itself, that it goes from that to that, point A to point Z.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing journey.
Right.
And so there's 2 books in that series. Is there plans to do more, maybe eventually?
Maybe, potentially I could see doing more. So the second book is set in Yellowstone National Park, and it's more of the science there. Some of the extremophiles that really do live in these thermal pools, in that kind of acidic water, hot temperatures. But in this book, they've been genetically modified. So they're, not like tiny little bacteria. They're giant things like Komodo dragons that are genetically modified. And that deals with actually some of the real gene editing technology that like scientists are using here in like Dallas to try to bring back the woolly mammoth.
The CRISPR technology?
CRISPR technology, yeah. So CRISPR technology is in the book, the extremophiles, and then just kind of the Wilds of Yellowstone. That was a little bit inspired by my husband and I. When we were first married, we did some backwoods camping in Yellowstone, and he's a fly fisherman, so he wanted to get out to this kind of remote place. And the park ranger told us when we arrived at this kind of backwoods area that a grizzly bear, well, the grizzly bears, I guess, were particularly hungry that summer because there had been a shortage of food. And the park ranger said, the grizzly has just killed a moose on the trail up ahead. So, we're getting that cleaned up, but be mindful because he told us we had like a 75% chance of having to run in with a grizzly bear. Did we turn around and go home? No, we kept on because, there was fly fishing to be done. And, thankfully, we were not killed by a grizzly, but I remember like the whole time we were hiking going, no bears, trying to alert these bears that you're there. So that left an impression of Yellowstone in my mind. It's this beautiful, wild, remote place, but like it's also dangerous and anything can happen. So that was part of why it's the setting for this second book of, because the kids, end up getting separated pretty early on from the adults when an earthquake happens. So they're trying to manage in the park. And there actually is a scene in the book where there's a dead moose on the trail, but it was not killed by a grizzly. The name of the book again kind of gives away.
Spoiler if it's in the title, right?
Yeah, if it's in the title, you can imagine what might have got it. So that's another kind of real life thing from years back that ended up in a book. So
that is so cool. I mean, I remember, so I was born in Alaska and lived there for about 10 years. And they have a marathon up there close to Anchorage, but it's everything's remote out there. And the marathon, you have to have a bear siren on you. When you run on this, it's a trail marathon because you're just constantly pressing the siren just to make sure that no bears come.
Yeah, you don't want to catch the bears by surprise.
Well, that would be, I always thought a good idea for stories that, the short faced bears, those giant bears that used to live at the time of the woolly mammoth, but they're giants. And you Google them and they're massive. And I'm like, what if not all of them died? What if some of them were still up there? And there's some really creepy stories in Alaska, but always thought it's cool that you can go from place to place, and because there was one in Texas where you're from, and then you went to Yellowstone for another story.
Yeah, her dad was
drawing on real life experiences. I think that's really good.
Yeah, that was a fun aspect to kind of be able to mix it up and deal with different biomes and deal with just especially with them being kind of the weird nature books. It's fun to be able to change the setting because the location has so much to do with like the nature that you encounter.
Yeah. So. And so then you wrote, the first manuscript, and did you get an agent? You just submitted it to a bunch of places.
I actually did what was called, it's not around really anymore, but it was called Pitch Wars. Pitch Wars was a kind of a mentorship program / internet contest. So you would submit, they would have all these different published authors or agented, just basically people who were maybe further along in their publishing journey than the people who were applying to be mentored. So I think it went on for about 10 years. Maybe it stopped last year or the year before, something like that. But you would submit your manuscript to these different mentors in different categories. They had some for middle grade and young adult and adult. And then if you got selected, the program would be that these mentors would give you feedback on your manuscript, try to help you get it really ready for querying, which is where you go and, submit to agents. I know, I'm saying it more for the audience. It's not familiar, but so I ended up getting selected for that with a couple of middle grade mentors. And I think that was in 2018. It's kind of like towards the end of the year is when it happened. So it was like the end of 2018. And they gave me some helpful feedback on my manuscript. And then in February of 2019 is when they have, for that particular contest, the kind of prizes that you get to submit like a little blurb on your manuscript on the Pitch Wars website. And then agents will go in and actually request your manuscript from there. So it's kind of, they call it like the Pitch Wars Showcase, I think is what it is. And so because it was pretty well known at the time, and, a lot of people had signed with agents from it. So it was kind of, it was an exciting thing to be a part of because it was kind of competitive getting in. And then, you were hoping that the agents would look at look at your, little blurb and then request. And some people get lots of requests, and then some people just get a few, but it's still pretty exciting to be, as opposed to normally, writers were always, submitting things to the agents. And this was kind of fun to have them kind of requesting from us instead of the other way around, where we're, seeking out them and, will you look at this? What do you think? So that was a fun experience. And I got, a handful of agent requests of wanting to look at the manuscript. And then one of them did end up offering, she wanted to represent the book. And so kind of the way that process works is, while you've put that out there, you've also queried other agents at the same time. So the agents I had already queried, I let them know, hey, I've received this offer of representation. And if you'd like to, read the full manuscript or whatever, you have till kind of this day, it's like letting everybody know what's going on so that if they want to offer, they can, or whatever. So I ended up getting another offer of representation from one of the people who had the manuscript as well. So I had a couple of offers of representation, which was, great and exciting. And I ended up going with the one who she represented a lot of children's fiction and seemed really knowledgeable in the industry. So I felt really excited and comfortable going with that one, who it wasn't the original one who had offered from the Pitch Wars contest. So I didn't actually get it from Pitch Wars, but that kind of like got the ball rolling,
Did you think the entire time you're like, oh, this isn't gonna happen to me. No, maybe this is just fun. And then all of a sudden you get an offer.
Yeah. I think I knew with Pitch Wars that a lot of people did get offers. So, you have that mixture of kind of like doubt and then hope. So it's like, which one
in the game.
Yeah. Keeps of which emotion is like prevailing that day. Sometimes it's like you think nobody's going to offer, and then other times you're like, surely everybody's going to want this. A wild range of emotions that we have.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And your publisher is
it's Simon & Schuster.
Simon & Schuster. I was going to say them, but I didn't want to get it wrong. And it was published your first book was published in 2020.
Yes.
So was it? When did you find out it would be published? And then when did you find out about the pandemic?
Yeah. So, we went after I signed with my agent. We ended up going on submission shortly thereafter, which was where, you submit your manuscript to some different publishers. And then because she was a pretty well-known agent, we heard back pretty quickly. Sometimes that process can be slower, just sort of depending on a lot of factors. But we heard back from a couple of publishers quickly who were interested in buying it. And I ended up having 2 different publishers who wanted to buy it. And then we went with the editor at Simon & Schuster. She had represented actually one of my son's favorite books at the time. So I was like, this seems like a good, like my son loves this book. And my editor sent me the arc of the book 2 of that particular author's advanced reader copy. She's like, because I told her, my son loves this book.
Can I ask?
Hotel Between was the name of the book. And she's like the arc of the second book. So my son loved that. So that helped seal the deal, I think, with me going with her. So I think that was in something like June of 2019. And then, it was decided the book's going to come out in September of 2020, which is actually fairly fast for traditional publishing. Sometimes it's like 2 years, I guess, with her schedule or whatever, it just kind of worked out that timing wise, that's when it was going to come out, and then of course we all, about March 2020 is when everybody became very aware of what was going on. But I think at that time, everybody had high hopes that this was going to be like a briefer, kind of, initially we were thinking that it wouldn't last so long. So I was like, surely by September, things are going to be good, and I'll still be able to do all the normal things and stuff. But my arcs ended up getting stuck in the Simon & Schuster, in New York. They were stuck there for a bit whenever things closed down, but they were eventually able to get those out. But I did, instead of like an in-person launch, I did a virtual launch and kind of virtual school visit, things like that. But
kept the momentum going. I mean, I remember one of my favorite places to go with I had 2 kids at the time, 3 kids at the time, and my favorite place to take them was to Barnes & Noble, and they would they would play with the little train sets, and then I would go and look at all the books, because that's kind of the genre that I like, is that those authors in that area. And so that's where I would see all the new releases and stuff. And then they shut down in March, and I went to the Barnes and Noble and tried to buy their little train set just straight from them, and they're like, no, we'll bring them out, we'll bring them back out, and they still haven't brought them out.
Yeah.
I missed that, especially. I think that was the hardest thing the thing I missed the most was just seeing the new books and then seeing all the new authors out and everything. But I found your book, I think a while back, the Mutant Mushrooms one. I did see it. And you're also the narrator of your audiobook, The Legend of Greyhallow. She also narrates, what's the Small Spaces? Is it Catherine Arden?
Yeah.
Phenomenal narrator. You couldn't have asked for a better narrator. I mean, she's so good.
Yeah, I think she did great. They gave me a few options of actresses to look at, and I thought, but yes, she was a great voice for my main character. She had the main character for The Legend of Greyhallow, is pretty impetuous. She's, just raring to go. And I thought she had the most childlike excitement in her voice. And then she does, of course, a great job with the other characters that she portrays as well. It was really fun to listen to with my family. I was like, there's this character, that one. And so that was really
good. And I think that's great. That was a great connection, because so she did Catherine Arden into those 4 books, really well done. And the narration, again, was fantastic by that narrator. Whose name
Renee Dorian.
Renee Dorian, exactly. She's so good. And so, what ends up happening on Amazon and on Audible is that you get this sort of, it starts featuring books. And that's really where I made the connection of who you were. So then I saw you on Twitter. I was like, oh, yes, yeah, I've recognized this name. And so, it really, that a great narrator makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Because that was some of my thoughts when I was selecting her. I thought, okay, well, these books, the Small Spaces, seem like it could potentially attract readers who might like some of the, type of things that I've written. So I'm glad that ended up playing out.
Yeah. So actually with that, let's segue into The Legend of Greyhallow. Tell me about that book and the inspiration behind that, and kind of give a brief synopsis of it. Without spoilers, obviously.
Sure, I'll do my best. No. The Legend of Greyhallow is set in a town where this epic fantasy movie filmed years earlier. All the old movie sets are there. They have a Greyhallow themed festival every summer, and where people come in costumes like trolls and goblins and elves and gnomes and all of that. And the main characters, Ainsley and her little brother Tobin, their family has just moved to Lowry, this town, and their parents have purchased this rundown mansion that once belonged to director Ripley, who is the director of the Legend of Greyhallow movies. But he disappeared 20 years earlier. So it's this rundown place that they plan to turn into a movie-themed bed and breakfast. So while the kids are checking out their new house, they discover in the attic all this old film equipment, like a movie projector and clapperboard, which is, the thing you clap it down and all of that.
Old school stuff. Yeah.
Old school stuff. And trunks filled with Greyhallow costumes and all of that. So, they start putting on costumes and playing, and they get the movie going. And, one thing leads to another, and the movie has come to life. So it's a story about going into this favorite fictional world, and then what happens when these two worlds meet, and the kids have to solve kind of puzzles that are left behind for them. They have to deal with these different characters from the world of Greyhallow.
That's amazing. And I'm halfway through the Audible, the audio version now. Really good. Again, the narrator's fantastic. I couldn't recommend it more highly. Great story and great narration. It's definitely something I'm going to be listening to with my kids, because they're really into reading. So it's
nice,
really good. Now, tell me though, what was the inspiration for that one? Was that a documentary as well?
Okay. So part of the inspiration for that one, my family and I, we had been watching the old Twilight Zone shows from like the 1960s. We only watch things that are at least 40 like years old.
Yeah, those are the good. That's the good stuff.
Yeah. So we were watching that, and there was an episode of the Twilight Zone where this silent film star, she, was kind of washed up at that point. It had been years since, her movies had been a big hit. Kind of like a Sunset Boulevard, if you're familiar with that story. So she was, a previous silent film star. And she spent all of her time watching all of her old films, like in this darkened room in her mansion. And then, she just like yearned for all those days. But by the end of the show, she ends up stepping into the world of her old films. And like, everyone's like, where's she? Where's she? And they look up, and on this, black and white screen in her living room, she's there. So that, I thought, that stuck in my mind. And originally, The Legend of Greyhallow, when I pitched it, I had the idea for that book, even when I was signing with my agent originally, because I pitched it to her as Sunset Boulevard meets Jumanji. So my idea was going to be originally more like that kind of original show that we were talking about,
Yeah.
And so I did start a version like that. As I had also read at the same time a book called Abandoned Mansions. And it was about all these, I can't remember exactly, but I can't remember if it was about one particular kind of wealthy, eccentric heiress person, or if it was a variety of them. But, kind of these houses that were left behind. So that the house was originally going to deal with, all of that and the mystery of why that house was the way it was. But, ideas are always like changing. You have these one little bit of it, or at least for me. And then I find that things evolve as I get going on it. So for a long time, it did center around kind of that particular actress and all of that. But then it changed. And I was actually kind of towards the latter part of working on that project. I was like rereading like Lord of the Rings, and which I love. And, I was like, I really want the movies to be more like a fantasy movie than like maybe like the old kind of timey. They were originally going to be more like golden age of Hollywood kind of movies. But then I decided, I'm actually going to turn them into, because I love like the Lord of the Rings fandom. I love I'd love to go to Hobbiton in New Zealand where they filmed the movies. And so basically once that happened, it was like rewrite. And I made it more where it's this fantasy series that they go into. And, the town it's not just somebody's house. It's like the whole sets are, and all of the, everything around the house is even kind of like movie themed because of these particular movies filming there. So yeah, the idea kind of ebbed and flowed with as I went.
That's amazing. My wife and I are big Lord of the Rings fans. In fact, I don't know. Let's see if my camera, I've tilted up. You can see there's a Goonies. There's a Goonies thing up there. Sean Astin, Samwise.
Yes.
He signed that for me. And I met him. He worked on we were doing a gala. He was there and interviewed him. He is nothing like.
He's not Samwise.
No, you would think it's the weirdest. And you see him in Samwise, you see him in Rudy, you see him where he's more stoic, right? But in real life, he's like the best description is a golden retriever puppy.
That's so fun.
He's like laughing, and he's joking, and he's saying all these things, and he's going off. He's the happiest person ever. But that was and I got a picture of him and my wife. We're holding our daughter next to him. And then whenever we watch The Lord of the Rings, they'll be like, Shannon, you met him. And she goes, I don't remember that. And I said, well, he wears a wig in this one. So but that's wonderful. I mean, that's a great concept, the Jumanji concept, to have the movie come to life.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I think if you're not supposed to say anything when you publish it, but are there plans for like sequels?
Maybe. I mean, I have ideas for, ways that the story could be expanded. And I, shortly before, I guess it was last summer, I was drafting out some ideas for a potential sequel. So we'll see. Currently I'm working on a separate project, but that's another middle grade kind of fantasy, but not connected to any of my other projects, just kind of a new thing. So, but we'll see. You never never know. I'm always happy to do continuations, because once you've created the original world and the original characters, you've done a lot of the groundwork, and it's always fun to revisit those characters that you love, because you do grow attached to all these settings and characters that you create. So I'm always happy to go back and play with them some more.
I feel like as an author, it's not it's not a good book unless your characters have a spring of life of their own in a way.
Yeah.
And that's what when I talk to authors, they're like, well, I wanted them to do one thing, but then once I started writing them, they sort of took on their own life and they made their own choices. And it's kind of a weird thing to consider. Yeah,
it is interesting. I always outline, my books before I start writing, and then some things stay on track, and then other things they do take on. In the Mutant Mushroom Takeover, my original outline was that Nate, who's the sidekick character who loves, YouTube and all of that, he was going to be like an antagonist to Maggie. He was going to be kind of like this bully. But then, like, within a few lines of writing him, he started being funny and like teasing Maggie. And I was like, oh, these guys are actually friends. Like, he's not, So it's funny the way things take shape once you get going.
Well, that was going to be the follow-up question, is talking about your creative process. I mean, from your initial idea to a finished manuscript, what steps do you take to bring your stories to life? But that's the question, but I think you've answered that in many ways. But, they talk about people who outline their stories and live by it, or people who just fly by the seat of their pants when they're writing but it seems like you do both.
Yeah, I definitely like to have an outline, like some type of roadmap at least. I don't need to know, everything that's going to happen, and I don't want to know. I like to be surprised. But I do want to make sure, like, the elements, that I at least know the elements of the story. There's certain things that need to be there in order for it to be like a fully realized idea for a book.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to spend 6 months working on something when, it's not, the pieces aren't there. I know that characters, they need arcs. They're going to be on a, this journey where they are changing and, developing. So, you have to at least have an idea of what's going to be happening there. I feel like for me, I know for my own process, people have different processes, but that's what works for me. And, I need to know something like some idea of the setting and things like that, but I am flexible. If something starts clicking and I think it's better, I go with it, and I'll discard a whole big bunch if I think something, I do that all the time. I'll have that's what I did with the whole Lord of the Rings thing. I was on deadline for that book. It was due in January, and I think it was due like January 15th.
Wow, no way.
It was October, and I had written like 30,000 words of this manuscript. And then I was just like, you know what? Like, I don't like this. I'm just going to set this file aside, and then I'm going to open a new file and just start. Because the other one's still there. I can go back to it. But so that's what I did. And I just started new with about 2 months or less before my deadline. And I'm happier with what I did, because I just was like, sometimes you have to kind of explore an avenue for something before you really see what it is you really want to do. So
before you find out that it's the wrong turn.
Yeah. So I always want to be open to whatever is going to be the best final product that I can make at that point in time. Whether, so I do that when I'm on deadline frequently. I get a note, if I'm working on some change from my editor, and then I figure out a way that I think I can make this change, even if it's going to require like a whole bunch of work. If I think it's going to be better, like, I want to do it, so.
One of my friends, he was an author, and he killed off one of his characters in the book. And a month before he was supposed to submit the final manuscript, he said, I shouldn't have done that. And so then he went back into the final book in his series, and he rewrote it so that the character didn't die, but it looked like he died. And it is one of the best redemption and funniest moments in the book. Like, and the way he did it, like, it was so perfect. But then he's like, but yeah, try to think about if I had killed that guy off. it just makes the book so sad. Like,
Yeah.
because he had to figure out the wrong turn before he figured out the right turn.
Yeah, yeah, and it'd be so convenient if every idea just was like delivered to you, like, you know. But then you wouldn't really be writing and creating if it was just, okay, here it is. I mean, that's the kind of the creative process is. It's exploratory. Whether you do it like, I mean, I think the difference when we talk about like pantsing versus, you know, plotting, everybody's still exploring. It's just if you choose to explore a little bit more on the front end to save yourself maybe some work later, or if you choose to kind of do it while you're writing and kind of skip some of the work up front. But it's still this exploration of figuring it out, because it's not like a plot arrived and all the characters and the setting arrived in this neat little bundle at your computer, you know. So all of us still have to just figure it out and make it up, you know, when you're writing fiction. And it's just kind of how you choose to go about like starting on it, what feels more comfortable.
Yep. And so I've noticed that, you know, your books, there's a lot of science and setting. It seems to be very important, you know, there's some scientific information that we like really played a role in developing mutant mushrooms. And then going to the settings and seeing these places, those played a crucial role. But, you know, as you're writing them and these characters are trying to explore and discover and become new people, overcome things, what are some of the themes that for you were coming out that you really wanted to express and, you know, have your readers learn about in these books? What was important to you? What messages, I guess, were important to you to convey in these books?
Yeah. You know, I always think about wanting to have, you know, a positive impact on readers and wanting to convey truths, things like that. I don't necessarily set out to have like a theme or like a moral, because I think that's hard to do without it maybe being like a heavy-handed sort of thing. So I think more in terms of, you know, all characters and stories, they convey messages about like what is ultimately good, what is evil, what sorts of behavior do we think are kind of like praiseworthy, or like the types of things that, you know, you want to emulate. So I think more in terms of kind of character depictions and plots, as opposed to maybe like one central thing. I think about how stories, in the way, just like who we make our hero be, what do we villainize? Kind of interesting. I was reading for homeschool. One of my kids, they one of the books they had to get for one of their classes was it's a book on Hitler Youth. You know, the indoctrination that went into creating, you know, these generation of young people who had, you know, all these hateful ideology. But in one of the pictures it showed was a child's fiction book that was being used as propaganda for teaching these young children. I think it was called, actually had the word mushroom, and I think it was called like the rotten mushroom or something like that. And of course it was this anti-Semitic, you know, piece of propaganda, but it was written in a children's storybook. So you think about the power that stories have to, what do we say about, you know, messages, you know, of, okay, are elderly people worthy? Are, you know, these people who are maybe weak in some way, or, you know, some, you know, like with some people with disabilities, or, you know, just the different ways you frame characters and the different way, you know, you set up the stories. I think even though it doesn't have to necessarily be something where you set out, well, I'm going to say X message. I think it's in these more subtle things of how do we show that, you know, being beautiful and prideful and fast and smart talking, is that the way that heroes, you know, overcome? Or is it in sacrifice? Or is it in, you know, maybe learning humility? You know, there's these different things that I think you can communicate, that I try to communicate things that I think are true and good and right and all of that, through a variety of, hopefully just my worldview comes out through that. I don't necessarily try to sit down and be like, this is what I'm going to say here. I just more hope that like I'm maybe firm enough in what I believe to be true and right, and worthy and good and all of that sort of thing, that just kind of by osmosis, I hope will be come out through the stories that I write and the things that I choose to depict in what I write.
Well, yeah, and I think that's important. I mean, as a parent, there's just you become more sensitive to you watch a show you watched when you were a kid, and you're like, I didn't realize that was in there, and
Yeah,
you're embarrassed. You're like, oh, I didn't. Oh, you want to make sure that that you're presenting things to the kids that inspire them just to be good people.
right.
And so that's what I gravitate towards that. Even though I kind of I like these ghost stories that are a little scary, um, like again, Catherine Arden, her name, and then Jonathan Stroud. They write scary stories, but the scary stories is a backdrop. It's there's a darkness to it, but then it shows the light of these characters who are doing good things,
Right.
and that's what I really like. I really like people who make a concerted effort, or who, by, like you said, osmosis, their characters are shining light in opposition to whatever the darkness is inside of this book. So
That's an interesting point you make about kind of like villains and things like that. Some of my writer friends and I have been talking about, like villains in children's literature and things like that, and kind of like the idea of darkness in children's fiction and things like that. And I think, there's obviously age appropriate ways to do that. But the idea, that is kind of a truth of the world, though, that we do encounter adversaries and things like that. There's like a famous quote that's different. Sometimes it's attributed to Neil Gaiman. Sometimes it's attributed to, I can't remember who else, but other people, that these stories don't tell children that, dragons are real, that they already know that these kind of bad guys are out there and real. But what these stories say and these fairy tales say are that dragons can be defeated, that the kind of the point of these stories and things like a story isn't to say, oh, look at this scary thing, that scary thing, whatever. Kids know that they're going to encounter, and they do encounter at their level things that are, adversaries. But I think, in a story, when you see someone overcoming obstacles, you have to have a real obstacle in order to overcome it, because kids can kind of smell out a phony too. If everything's too perfect and shiny in the world, that's not really true for anybody's world, even a kid's world. Again, age appropriate, for your 4-year-old, you're not going to have something all spooky and scary, but you have, think of a kid who's 10, 11, 12, they've already, they know that there's things out there that are rough. And I think stories can embolden and encourage, us as adults and kids to see that these obstacles can be overcome. And, that's kind of that model. If you look at characters who are heroes, and they can see, wow, that scary thing, what did they do to overcome that? You hope that can kind of give kids a little oomph to kind of go out. I know from stories that I've read, sometimes you see a character and then it does encourage you, so even as an adult, stories that I often think of like Lord of the Rings and different things from it. I'm like, it's impactful. Even a fiction, I think, has an impact.
Well, I think children's fiction is, what is it, C.S. Lewis, who said, someday you'll be old enough to start reading stories again. And when you go back to that, you realize, well, especially him. I mean, when he wrote Narnia stuff and just how deep it was, you're like, oh, like, the dragons that are in there, what they represent, about the greed and the witches and what they represent. And I mean, it's fascinating. And I do think you're more likely to learn meaningful things as a child reading a children's book. And then you go through adulthood and you think you know everything, and then you go, okay, well, I'm going to go back to these stories, and you learn there's a lot of truth in there.
Yeah.
You were talking just at the end of that about how it's about challenges and overcoming some of those things, and that leads into the next question, about, which would be great. I mean, in these stories, these characters that you've written, they become the heroes, they overcome challenges. But you are writing these stories. I mean, could you share an example of a challenging moment you faced while writing, while publishing, while getting the books out there, and how you overcame it, how you move forward with your own hero's journey in this process?
Yeah. So I think about, I do think about the hero's journey, and, as you study that and like the aspect of it in writing, then you do start to apply it. You think about how we're all sort of on these journeys of trying to overcome our obstacles and, be victorious and heroic and do the right thing and all of that. So I think for me, like with writing, it's, it's an interesting kind of career path. You do a lot of it alone and you pour like your heart out into these things. And then there's that whole other side of, kind of publishing where you put your work out into the world and, whatever reaction you hope to get, you don't always get, or whatever it is, there's a lot of things you don't have control of. You have control of writing your book, but then, different things that happen after that, you're not able to control everything, which is true for probably, many things in life, not just writing. But
Yeah.
So I think the aspect of where you have put a lot of time into things and, you don't always see immediate, I don't always hear back from readers immediately, things like that, so I think discouragement is something that a lot of authors have to kind of deal with. And, I know myself, I always want to, do something impactful and purposeful and things like that. And so it can be easy sometimes to feel discouraged, I think, of like, oh, am I making any difference? Is, all of those types of things where it's, I think, easy to feel, just discouraged with the amount of time you spend on things and all of that. So I've had a number of periods of that off and on with writing. And, sometimes I'm like, I'm done. I'm not going to write anything else and things like that. And, part of what helps me is just, a lot of times we don't see what our work does like immediately. You put things out there. And this is true, not just for being a writer, but, you think about people who assemble cars or whatever. If you did a good job, you probably don't hear back from a lot of people, but like if you did a bad job, maybe like something bad happens, with the car because it didn't work. I mean, maybe that's not the best analogy, but my point is that, we don't always hear back immediately, but like, then I'll hear back from kids, who are like, oh, I loved your book. I read this and that, or, you hear back from different people. And then it's just a good reminder that, we don't always see the impact that the things we spend time on have right away. And then you have to kind of like press on, and do the thing and like steward what you have well. Like if you have these different opportunities and talents and resources to be able to do this job, whatever the job is. For me, it's writing, to try to do that well and not like always be like looking over my shoulder of like, okay, well, did this person like it? Did this, or did it receive this? Did it get that? Like always be looking for like external validation as opposed to just doing the job well and like be faithful to like the opportunities that you have. And that's like what I can steward. I can try to do the best job that I can, be kind to the people I meet when I have opportunities to do school visits or talk with a homeschool group, or, I meet a kid somewhere who's like, I loved your book so much. Like, when are you coming out with a new book? So like be thankful and grateful for that and not always be just, okay, am I doing enough? I think it's, there's some quote about like, don't kind of like pull up your garden, like while it's growing. It's something along the lines of, it's like, it's like you're doubting, is this working? Is this happening? So you go and rip it up to see if it's working. It's like, don't destroy what's growing and happening with doubt. Let have gratitude and just like have faith that you do what you can and the rest is kind of out of your hands.
What's your children's reactions been to you being a published author? I think about that like as how cool it would be. I'm working on stuff, but when it finally gets out there, and then the pride that your kid has and what they say and how they feel and what they say to you, like what's some of the rewarding moments with your kids? Yeah,
I think particularly, my husband's an entrepreneur as well, and then the path of an author is sort of entrepreneurial as well. You might work with a publisher, but that's still, most of it's kind of on your own, and a lot of the things that you do are sort of independently driven, even with a traditional publisher. And so I think for my kids, it gives them an inspiration that it's these different creative pursuits that they can do, or that it's possible and within reach. It doesn't seem, like some fancy job. I know growing up, I felt like, there were certain career paths, real career paths, and maybe other things that didn't seem like something a real person would do, But like my daughter, she's very artistic and she loves to create three-dimensional art and, all of these things. And she thinks about, I could open an Etsy shop, or I could do this or that. my son likes to make, like strategy board games and things. And so I just think that some of these
awesome
things, I think that they see them as really real possibilities because of, it's like, okay, well, dad did this and mom did this. And so sometimes I think when your kids see that these different pursuits, they see you doing them, I think they feel, even if they don't come up to you and say, wow, I'm so impressed by you, because what kid says that, I think it's more that concept of they see it as something that they could do themselves. And I think it opens up just kind of possibilities in their own mind of the ways that they could, go out into the world and do different things. So that makes me happy.
Well, I think that answers the almost the last question that I had was, what kind of impact do you hope your books will have on readers? And
I don't know. I have so many hopes that it's hard to like put them all into like, one sentence, I think. Ultimately, I hope that they have a positive impact. I hope that people, feel more hopeful and encouraged and all sorts of things. I don't know. I think it's kind of, that's like I plant a seed of some type of something with whatever I go out and do. And then it's exciting to see what might grow out of that. You sprinkle some things and you don't know exactly what will happen, but ultimately I try to do good, and I try to, steward what I have as best I can. And I'm always trying to learn and grow as well. I'm not done growing myself, but so it's exciting to see the fruit of what comes out of things that you do, though. Like when you hear back from, I heard back from someone actually today who had read my books, and they were like, you don't know how much this means. We loved it so much. And, it was just what I needed to hear. I was like, well, that's really amazing that you guys felt that way about my books.
Well, I think it's great too. I mean, I go back to that. What you had told me at the beginning is that you're at home, you're doing homeschooling, and you watch this documentary, and there's this whole story of being with your kids and helping as best you can, and then all of a sudden, from point A to point Z, you've published this book, and it's reaching all of these people. I just saw today, like when I downloaded the audiobook, it was so new, it hadn't had any reviews, and now it's getting reviews that are coming in. They're all 5 stars and everything, and so it's very clear to me that you're on the right track, and that it's making an impact, that people love your writing, and there's only better things to come. I can see it, and I'm excited for you. Where can people find you, and how can people support you? And I do think you're going to have some interest in maybe homeschooling, things that you can do, presentations, or even school presentations. So where can people find you, and how can they support you in that way or get your book?
Yeah, so my books are for sale wherever you like to buy books, that type of thing. But if you want to kind of find out more about me and connect in that way, my website is summerrachelshort.com, and I actually do have on there some free resources that go with like the Meat Mushroom Takeover. I have a unit study. Since I homeschool, I made a unit study, and it has things like a mushroom scavenger hunt, like mushroom drawing guides, all sorts of fun things like that, and some information on my school visits that I do at schools, and virtual visits that I do with homeschool groups or libraries, things like that. I have a variety of different presentations that I've done with groups out there, writing workshops and things. So I think if people buy my books and they like them, they can always, give reviews or telling their friends. It's a great way. Word of mouth is a huge way that people find out about books. If you think about the last book you read from a recommendation, it was probably a friend who was just telling you how much you had to read this book. You need to go read it. I loved it. So I know kids have found my books that way because their friend told them that they just had to read it. So,
well, it's like our whole neighborhood, except for us and maybe one other family, but our whole neighborhood does homeschooling here. So I can already see that being like, once I'll just post it even on my personal Instagram, like, hey, I interviewed Summer Rachel Short, and here's the cover of her books, and I already know they're going to be like, okay, how do we know her? What do we do? And so So I hope those people.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, they can, if they like to do unit studies too, make sure they download that unit study. They can learn all about mushrooms, all the weird and normal mushrooms that are out there.
The possessive ones, the zombie ones too, right?
The zombie ones too. Yeah.